Eleanor Whitmore pressed her bare hands into the cracked earth and did not flinch, not when the dirt bit into her fingers, not when the dead trees cast no shade above her, not even when she heard his boots turn away on the gravel behind her, walking back toward the house, walking back toward a life that had never once included her. She pressed deeper, because if this land was truly dead, she needed to know it herself. And if it wasn't, then everything they had done to her was about to matter. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel. Follow every part to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Eleanor Whitmore remembered that detail with the kind of precision a woman only develops when she is trying to locate the exact moment her life stopped belonging to her. Tuesday, late June. The heat already sitting heavy on the Virginia hills, like something that had given up trying to leave. Her mother had read it first. She always read everything first, not out of nosiness, but out of the particular exhaustion of a woman who had learned that bad news, if received slowly, could be stretched into something almost bearable. But that morning, her mother had not stretched it. She had simply set the letter on the kitchen table, smoothed it flat with the heel of her hand, and said, "Eleanor, sit down." Eleanor sat. She read. And by the time she reached the third line, she understood that Tuesday was the last morning she would wake up in this house and still belong to herself. The Whitmore family owed money. This was not a new condition. It was, in fact, the oldest and most permanent truth of their household, more reliable than the seasons, more constant than the leaking roof above the east bedroom, more familiar than the smell of the kitchen in the mornings. What was new was the amount. $1,100. Eleanor read the number twice, then a third time. Not because she didn't understand it, but because understanding it and accepting it were two entirely different things, and she needed a moment to cross from one to the other. $1,100 owed to a creditor by the name of Caldwell, of the Caldwell Financial Partnership, operating in representation of various estate interests throughout the Virginia frontier counties. She set the letter down. "Who is Caldwell?" she asked. Her mother looked out the window. "Men who buy other men's problems," she said quietly, "and then sell the solutions." Eleanor waited. Her mother turned back to face her. "There is an arrangement," she said. "The Caldwell Partnership has agreed to transfer the debt, to absorb it entirely on one condition." "What condition?" Her mother's hands folded in her lap. "That Colonel Jonathan Mercer of Mercer Estate takes a wife before the end of summer." Eleanor stared at her. "And," her mother continued, "that the wife comes from a family already indebted to the Caldwell interest." The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that happens when a woman realizes she has already been decided upon before she was ever consulted. "He doesn't know me," Eleanor said. "No. I don't know him." "No. And he agreed to this, too." Her mother looked at the table. "The Colonel has his own reasons for needing this arrangement to be settled quickly. It isn't about you, Eleanor. It never was." That last sentence was meant to be comforting. It wasn't. She had 3 days to pack. 3 days to look at every room of the only home she had ever known and memorize the details that she understood somewhere, deep and wordless, she would not see again for a very long time. Maybe never. She packed carefully, practically. 1 good dress, 2 working dresses. Her mother's gardening book, cloth-bound, water-stained, annotated in her mother's cramped handwriting in the margins, the only inheritance Eleanor had ever expected or wanted. She packed it last, wrapped it in linen, set it at the bottom of the trunk where it would not shift during the journey. Her mother stood in the doorway and watched her. "He's a fair man," her mother said finally. "That's what people say." "People say a lot of things," Eleanor answered. "They say he's principled. So is a man who keeps his word when the word was never worth keeping." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "Eleanor, I'm sorry." Eleanor closed the trunk latch. She did not turn around immediately. She needed a moment, just a moment, to put that apology somewhere that would not break her. Then she turned around and she smiled. It was not a performance. It was the particular smile of a woman who has decided not to spend her grief in front of someone she loves. "Don't be," she said. "I'll write." The journey to Mercer Estate took 2 days by carriage. The road grew rougher as they moved west. The trees thickened. The farms became wider, more solitary, separated by long stretches of untouched land that still felt somehow like it was waiting for something. Eleanor spent most of the journey watching it pass. She did not have a picture of Colonel Mercer. She had a name, a title, and the single piece of information her mother had offered the morning of her departure. "He lost someone. Before all this, that's all I know." Eleanor had turned that sentence over for 2 days. He lost someone. She didn't know whether that was meant to explain him or excuse him. Probably both. Probably neither. Mercer Estate appeared in the late afternoon of the second day. The main house was large and well-built stone foundation, wide porch, upper windows shuttered against the summer heat. It was the kind of house that had once had a great deal of care taken with it, and had since been maintained by habit rather than love. There was a man standing on the porch steps when the carriage pulled up, tall, dark-coated despite the heat, arms at his sides. No hat in hand, he hadn't removed it in welcome. He simply stood there and watched the carriage come to a stop with the expression of someone completing a task they had agreed to complete. Eleanor stepped down without waiting for the driver to offer his hand. She looked at Colonel Jonathan Mercer directly. He looked back at her with eyes that were neither cruel nor warm, just flat and measuring, and already somewhere else. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Colonel Mercer," she answered. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have someone show you to your room," and turned back toward the door. Eleanor stood in the driveway with the Virginia summer pressing against her shoulders and watched him walk away. She had expected cold. She had prepared for cold. What she had not prepared for was being dismissed so thoroughly, so efficiently, so completely, as though his part of the arrangement had been satisfying the requirement of her arrival, and now that she had arrived, the matter was concluded. She breathed in, out. Then she picked up her own trunk, because no one had moved to help, and carried it toward the porch herself. She met the housekeeper inside, a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Phelps, stout, practical, with the manner of someone who had worked in this house long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything that happened in it. "I'll show you the rooms," Mrs. Phelps said, and did so efficiently without embellishment. The bedroom was adequate. The sitting room off it was plain. The window looked east toward a stretch of land that Eleanor could not yet make out clearly in the late afternoon light. "What's to the east?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Phelps paused at the door. "The orchard," she said, and her voice shifted just slightly. Not quite discomfort. More like the particular neutrality of someone who has learned not to have opinions about certain subjects. "Is it large?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Phelps said, and then she left. Eleanor did not see Colonel Mercer at supper. A place was set for him at the head of the table. The food was brought. After 20 minutes, Mrs. Phelps came quietly into the dining room and removed his place setting without explanation. Eleanor ate alone. The food was adequate. The silence was immense. Somewhere outside a window had been left open, and she could hear the evening insects starting up in the fields, the long rolling sound of a Virginia summer winding down toward night. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the particular way the light came through the south window in the late afternoons. The sound of her mother's hands moving in the garden. She finished her supper. She did not allow herself to cry. The next morning she found him on the rear porch. He was standing with a cup of coffee that had clearly gone cold, staring out at the land with the expression of a man performing the act of looking without actually seeing anything. Eleanor came to stand beside him. He didn't turn. "Good morning," she said. "Miss Whitmore." It was neither a greeting nor a dismissal, just an acknowledgement that she had spoken. She looked out at what he was looking at, and that was when she saw the orchard for the first time in proper daylight. 40 trees, gray, dry. Bark cracked and peeling. Branches reaching upward without a single leaf, without a single blossom, without any indication that they had ever done anything but stand there and slowly hollow out. She stared at them for a long moment. "How long have they been like this?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then, long enough. "When did they last produce?" A pause. "Before my father died." Eleanor kept her eyes on the trees. "What happened to them?" "Nothing happened to them," he said. "They just stopped." "Trees don't just stop," she said. He turned then for the first time since she'd come to stand beside him. He actually turned and looked at her. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't anger either. It was something closer to the expression of a man who had not expected to be contradicted before he'd finished his morning coffee. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice was very precise, "I brought you here to satisfy the terms of an arrangement, not to advise me on my land." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "I understand that, Colonel. And I'm not advising you. I'm asking a question." He held her gaze for one long beat. Then he set his coffee cup on the porch railing, turned and walked back inside. Eleanor turned back to the orchard. 40 dead trees. She tilted her head slightly and looked at the nearest one, at the bark, at the way it had cracked, at the angle of the lower branches. She had seen trees that died from drought, from disease, from blight. This did not look like any of those things. She stepped off the porch and walked toward them. She spent the rest of that morning in the orchard. No one told her not to. No one told her she could. She simply went, because the trees were there, and because something in her that had been trained by years of watching her mother work soil refused to look at something living or formerly living without wanting to understand it. She moved between the trees slowly, touched the bark, pressed her fingers into the soil at the roots, knelt and dug a few inches down with her bare hands. The earth was dry, but not dead dry. Not the chalky, compacted dryness of ground that had been abandoned for a decade. This was something else, a surface dryness, a skin of neglect, but underneath, she dug deeper. The soil was darker, richer, still alive. She sat back on her heels and stared at the nearest tree. Then she reached up and pressed her thumbnail against the bark, not hard, just firm the way her mother had taught her when she was small enough to stand under the branches of the trees in their own yard. She pressed, moved the bark slightly, and underneath it, just at the edge of the cracked green, a thin line of green cambium layer, alive, not thriving, barely surviving, but alive. Eleanor's hand stilled. She sat there in the summer heat with dead trees all around her, and a thin line of green under her thumb, and she understood something so clearly it almost felt like someone had spoken it aloud. These trees were not dead. They had been left to die. Those were two very different things. She didn't tell Colonel Mercer what she'd found. Not that day. Not because she was hiding it, but because she needed to understand it herself first. Needed to sit with it, turn it over, figure out what it meant and what it didn't mean, before she handed it to anyone else. Instead, she asked Mrs. Phelps about the estate history. Mrs. Phelps was careful, very careful. The kind of careful that tells you immediately that there are things in this house that have been decided upon, silently, collectively, not to be discussed. The estate was larger once, Mrs. Phelps said, wiping down the kitchen table with the focused attention of a woman who has learned to keep busy during difficult conversations. Colonel's father managed a great deal of land. The orchard was part of the original property. When did the Colonel's father die? 4 years past. And the orchard was already failing by then. Mrs. Phelps' hand slowed on the table. "I wouldn't say failing," she said. "I'd say it was already decided upon." Eleanor looked at her directly. "What does that mean?" Mrs. Phelps set down her cloth. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment, a real look, the kind that involves actually deciding something. "There were men who came," she said at last. "The winter before the old colonel died. Men from the Caldwell interest. They came. They looked at the land, they walked the orchard, and when they left, the orchard was declared. She paused, selecting her word carefully, unviable. By whom? By the county land assessor, who was at the time a man by the name of Dodd. And where is Dodd now? Mrs. Phelps looked at the table. Retired, she said. Bought himself a very comfortable little farm outside of Charlottesville. All of a sudden, like. Eleanor held that information very, very still inside herself. Thank you, Mrs. Phelps, she said. Mrs. Phelps picked up her cloth. I didn't say anything, she said, and went back to wiping the table. That evening, Eleanor did something she had not planned. She went looking for the estate records, not to steal them, not out of suspicion exactly, more out of the compulsion of a woman who has been handed a story with a gap in it and cannot rest until the gap is accounted for. The office was at the back of the house. She'd seen the door when Mrs. Phelps had given her the brief tour the first morning. Solid oak door slightly ajar this evening for the first time. She pushed it open. The room was not large. A desk, bookshelves, a fireplace unused in the summer heat. And against the far wall, almost hidden behind the angle of the bookshelf, a wooden panel that was not quite flush with the rest. Eleanor noticed it the way her mother had taught her to notice things in a garden by looking at what was slightly wrong. She walked to it, pressed her hand against it. The panel gave inward, half an inch, then held. She found the edge, pressed harder. The panel swung open. Behind it, a narrow shelf, dust-covered. 3 ledger books old and swollen with summer damp. A stack of folded documents tied with cord that had gone brittle with age. Eleanor picked up the first ledger. She opened it, and she began to read. She read for 2 hours. By the time she set the last ledger down, the candle she'd carried in from the hallway had burned a quarter of its length, and her hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular trembling that happens when a person realizes they have just read something that cannot be unread. The orchard had not failed. It had been profitable. The ledgers showed it clearly. Harvest records, sale figures, transport costs, profit margins. For 15 years, the Mercer orchard had produced steadily and well. And then a gap. A single quarter with no entries. And then a new entry, not a harvest record, but a debt notation. A loan drawn against the orchard property, $1,200. And the signature below it did not belong to Colonel Mercer's father. It belonged to someone named R. Caldwell, acting the notation read in fiduciary representation of the Mercer Estate interest. Eleanor set the ledger down very carefully, because that sentence meant something specific, legally speaking. It meant that someone named Caldwell had signed a debt onto Mercer land, as if he had the authority to do so. And then the orchard had been declared unviable. And then the debt had been transferred. And then, 4 years later, another version of that same debt had appeared in a letter on her mother's kitchen table, wearing a different number, requiring a different kind of payment. She sat in the dark office for a long time without moving. Then she picked up the ledgers, tucked them under her arm, carried them back through the house to her room, and locked them in the bottom of her trunk beneath her mother's gardening book. She slept badly, not from fear, from the particular restlessness of a woman who has a mind full of pieces that almost connect and cannot stop herself from turning them until they do. By 4 in the morning, she had given up on sleep. She dressed, went downstairs, made herself coffee from the kitchen stores, and stood in the gray pre-dawn with a cup in her hands, looking out the window toward the dark shape of the orchard. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on the stairs. Heavy, deliberate. The particular footfall of a man who has been awake for a long time before he started moving. Colonel Mercer appeared in the kitchen doorway. He stopped when he saw her. For a moment, they looked at each other across the dim room. "You're up early?" he said. "So are you?" she answered. He moved to the stove, stood with his back to her, poured himself coffee from the pot she'd already made. Silence. Then he said without turning around, "You were in my office last night." Eleanor did not flinch. "I was." He turned around. His expression was not anger, not quite. It was the expression of a man carefully deciding whether to be angry or whether anger would cost him something he couldn't afford to spend. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "this is my house, my estate. My business is not yours." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He waited. "But someone else seems to think it is," she said. He went very still. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. "Colonel Mercer, how much do you know about the Caldwell interest?" The silence that followed had a different quality than all the other silences she'd experienced in this house. The others had been cold, or empty, or simply absent. This one was charged. Like the air before a storm, when the weather hasn't decided what it's going to do yet, but has already made up its mind. "Enough," he said finally. "Do you know they have a representative who signed financial documents in your father's name? Do you know that the orchard was assessed as unviable by a man who was paid very comfortably to say so? Do you know that the debt my family owed, the debt that brought me here, is a second version of a debt that was written against this land 4 years ago by a man who had no authority to write it?" He said nothing. She kept her voice steady. "Do you know any of that, Colonel?" Another long silence. Then, "Where did you find those records?" "Behind the panel in your office wall," she said. "Someone hid them. My guess is it wasn't you." He turned away from her, faced the window. His back was rigid, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup with a tension she could see from across the room. "My father left those," he said finally. "I found the panel after he died. I read them. I didn't—" He stopped. "You didn't know what to do with them," Eleanor finished. He didn't answer, which was she had learned this man's particular kind of agreement. "Then you know the orchard isn't dead," she said. He turned back around. "The trees are dead, Miss Whitmore." "No, they aren't." Her voice was flat and certain. "I checked. The cambium layer is still alive on at least a third of those trees, maybe more. They've been neglected, starved of water, starved of attention, but they haven't gone past the line. Not yet." He stared at her. "I can bring them back," she said. "Given time and permission." "To what purpose?" His voice was low, almost raw. "Even if the trees come back, the debt remains." "No," she said. "That's what I'm telling you. If the original debt was fraudulent, if a man signed financial instruments without authority, and then the property was falsely assessed to manufacture a reason to collect on those instruments, then the debt is not legal. The whole structure of it is false." He was very quiet. "But you need evidence," she said. "Real evidence, not just hidden ledgers. Documented, dated, signed evidence." "And where," he said carefully, "do you propose to get that?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "One thing at a time, Colonel. First, I need to bring those trees back, because a living orchard is harder to condemn than a dead one." Something shifted in his face, very small, very controlled, but she saw it. "And what do you want in return?" he asked. "A pair of work gloves," she said. "Mine wore through on the journey." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. "Mrs. Phelps will find you some," he said, and walked back out of the kitchen without another word. Eleanor picked up her coffee cup. Her hands had stopped shaking. Outside the window, the orchard stood in the gray summer dawn. 40 trees, gray-barked and hollow-looking, stripped of everything that should have made them beautiful. She looked at them the way her mother had taught her to look at a struggling garden, not with pity, with intention. "What do you need?" she thought, "and what have you already survived?" The dawn light broke over the Virginia hills. Eleanor Whitmore drank her coffee and made her plans. She found the gloves on the kitchen table the next morning. No note, no explanation. Just a pair of worn but solid leather work gloves set precisely where she'd left her coffee cup the night before. Eleanor picked them up, turned them over in her hands. She put them on. They were too large a man's gloves, clearly, but she folded the cuffs back twice, and they held well enough. She flexed her fingers, felt the leather settle. Then she walked out to the orchard and went to work. She started with the tree nearest the house, the one she'd tested the night before, the one with the thin green line under the bark. She cleared the ground around its base, first pulling dead grass and compacted debris away from the roots, with her hands working in the low morning heat, before the day had fully committed to its worst. The soil beneath was what she'd expected: dense, crusted, starved of water and air both. She broke it up with a stick she found at the orchard edge, working it in rings around the base, loosening it inch by inch. She talked to the tree while she worked, not because she thought it could hear her, because her mother had always talked to trees, and the habit had settled into Eleanor's hands the same way all of her mother's habits had, quietly without announcement, until one day she'd looked up and realized she'd become the woman she'd been watching her whole childhood. "You're not gone," she told it. "You're just waiting. There's a difference." Behind her, gravel crunched. She didn't turn around. "You're talking to it," said a voice she didn't recognize. She turned then. A boy, 12, maybe 13, gap-toothed, with the deeply tanned face of a child who spent every waking hour outdoors, stood at the orchard edge with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who had come to look at something strange and was not yet sure whether it was worth the walk. "I am," Eleanor said. "Does it answer?" "Not in words," she said, "but trees talk back in their own way if you pay attention." He considered this with the serious frown of someone who had not yet decided whether to be skeptical or interested. Interested won, apparently, because he took a step closer. "They're all dead," he said, looking at the orchard. "They look dead," Eleanor said. "That's different." He looked at her. "You're the new Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore," she said. "Thomas," he said. "Tom. My pa works the south field." He paused. "He says the colonel brought himself a wife to satisfy the Caldwells." Eleanor kept her hands in the dirt. "Does he? Is that true?" "I reckon it's partly true," she said. "Things usually are. Partly." Tom thought about that. Then he crouched down at the tree base opposite her, looking at what she'd been doing. "What are you breaking up the ground for? Roots need to breathe," she said. "When the soil goes hard like this, the water can't get in and the air can't move. The tree starves slowly. It doesn't die all at once, it just gets smaller and smaller inside, until there's barely anything left." Tom pressed his finger into the dirt. "It's real hard," he said. "It's been this way a long time," she said. He looked up at her. "How long does it take to fix it?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've never fixed an orchard before. I've only fixed smaller things." He nodded gravely, as if this was a satisfactory answer. Then he stood up, put his hands back in his pockets and said, "I can help, if you want. I ain't got anything important until noon." Eleanor looked at him. "You know how to work soil." "Pa taught me." "Then yes," she said. "Find yourself a stick and start on the next tree over. Same rings. Don't go too deep, you'll cut the roots." Tom pulled a stick from the orchard edge, walked to the next tree, and started working without another word. Eleanor turned back to her own tree. She did not smile, not outwardly. But something in her chest settled just slightly. The particular settling of a woman who has been completely alone and has just unexpectedly acquired one ally. Even if that ally was 13 years old and gap-toothed, it was a start. Guy. Colonel Mercer saw them from the rear window. He didn't move away immediately. He stood there with his coffee going cold again. He had a habit with cold coffee. She would learn later that was essentially a record of every time something had stopped him mid-thought, and watched the woman he'd brought here to satisfy a contractual obligation crouching in the dirt of his dead orchard with one of the field workers' sons, breaking up the ground around trees that hadn't produced in 4 years. He watched for longer than he intended to. Then he set his cup down and went back to his desk. He had business of his own to attend to. The kind that kept him awake at 4 in the morning. The kind that had sat in his chest like a stone since the day he'd opened that panel in the office wall and read what his father had left behind, records of a theft so carefully constructed that it had taken him 2 years just to understand the shape of it, and another 2 to admit to himself that he didn't know how to fight it. He pulled out a letter he'd received 3 days prior. From a man named Hargrove, a county land attorney. He'd approached quietly carefully through 2 intermediaries, because approaching anyone directly in this county meant the approach would be reported back to Caldwell within the week. Hargrove's letter was short, professionally non-committal, which meant in the language of men who worked in counties controlled by other men's money that the answer was not yet. Too dangerous. Not enough. Not enough evidence. Not enough standing. Not enough certainty that a county judge would look at $1,200 fraud and rule against the men who'd funded his last 3 election seasons. Jonathan Mercer read the letter again, folded it, put it in the fire. Then he looked at the window again. She was still out there. By mid-morning, Tom had brought 2 other children from the south field. Eleanor hadn't asked him to. She'd simply turned around at one point and found 2 girl sisters by the look of them 8 and 10, crouching beside Tom at the 3rd tree, watching what he was doing, and copying it with the intense focused mimicry of children who don't want to be caught not knowing something. "This is Mary, and this is June," Tom said without looking up from his work. "Hello, Mary. Hello, June," Eleanor said. "Hello, ma'am," said June, the older one. Mary said nothing, but she dug her stick into the ground with considerable conviction, which Eleanor decided counted as a greeting. "Tom," Eleanor said, "when you get to the root line, ease up on the pressure, like this." She moved to show him, guiding the angle of the stick. "You want to loosen, not lift. The roots are shallow, but they're there." Tom adjusted, nodded. "How do you know all this?" June asked. "My mother taught me," Eleanor said. "She had a garden. Small, but she knew it better than anything." "Is she here?" "No," Eleanor said. "She's back home." June considered this. "Do you miss her?" Eleanor kept her hands moving. "Every day," she said simply. "Now see that dark patch of soil just there at the base? That's where the moisture is still holding. We want to open the ground around that, not through it. Can you do that?" June leaned in and looked, then she nodded and went back to work. Eleanor moved to the next tree. She was on her 7th when she heard boots behind her, heavier than a child's, slower than someone in a hurry. She looked up. Colonel Mercer stood 6 feet away, with his coat off for the first time since she'd arrived, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, holding a proper spade. He looked at the spade, looked at her, looked at the trees. "You're doing it wrong," he said. Eleanor raised her eyebrows. "Am I?" "The soil here doesn't drain east to west, it drains north to south. The water runs downhill toward the creek bed. If you break the crust, the same direction all the way around, you'll just move the problem." He paused. "You need to open channels toward the low ground. Give the water somewhere to go when it rains." Eleanor looked at the tree she'd been working on, looked at the ground, looked at the slight slope she hadn't paid quite enough attention to. He was right. She hated that he was right. And then she decided that hating it was a waste of good energy. "Show me," she said. He blinked, as if he'd expected an argument and had not prepared for the alternative. Then he walked forward, crouched beside the tree, and began showing her. Tom and the 2 girls watched from 3 trees over with the focused attention of children witnessing something they couldn't quite categorize but understood to be significant. Eleanor watched his hands and learned. They worked until noon without speaking much. He worked beside her, not directing after that first correction, just working. Moving from tree to tree with the focused efficiency of a man who had been raised on this land and had somewhere in his body a knowledge of it that predated his anger toward it. At noon, Mrs. Phelps appeared at the orchard edge with a water pail and 4 tin cups, and the expression of someone who had seen unexpected things before, but was quietly adding this to the list. Tom and the girls took their cups and drank deeply. Eleanor drank. Mercer drank. For a moment they stood side by side in the summer heat, the orchard stretching out around them. 10 trees now with the ground broken and breathing 30 more still waiting. And there was something in the air between them that was not warmth exactly, and was not yet trust, but was something adjacent to both. The particular silence of two people who have worked alongside each other and found without wanting to that the other person knows what they're doing. Mrs. Phelps collected the cups and left. Tom and the girls drifted back toward the south field, and Jonathan Mercer stood there for a moment, looking at the 10 trees with their cleared ground and their slightly better prospects, and said very quietly, more to himself than to her, "My father planted these." Eleanor said nothing. "He planted them the year he married my mother," he said. 40 trees. Said he wanted something to grow alongside the family." He paused. "She died when I was 7. He kept the trees going anyway. Said it was the last thing she'd seen healthy." Eleanor looked at the trees. "And then the Caldwells came," she said. "And then the Caldwells came," he agreed. Another silence. "I found the original debt instrument," she said carefully, "in the ledgers, the one signed by R. Caldwell. Colonel, that signature isn't legal. A creditor cannot sign a debt instrument as both the lender and the fiduciary representative of the borrower. That's not an arrangement. That's fraud." He looked at her sharply. "I know what it is," he said. "Then you know it can be challenged." "I know it should be challenged," he said, and his voice had an edge to it. Not anger at her, she understood, but the particular edge of a man who has been running into walls for so long, he started to sound like the walls. "I know the difference between what's legally true and what's practically possible in a county where the judges are—" He stopped. "Where the judges are what?" she pressed. He looked at her. Something in his face, some calculation, some long-running internal argument shifted. "Compromised," he said. Eleanor held that word, turned it over. "Then we don't go to the judges first," she said. He stared at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean truth needs an audience before it needs a verdict," she said. "If the right people know the right things before anyone goes to court, the judge's options get smaller." "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly, "what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," she said, "that we make sure the evidence is so visible, so public, so impossible to quietly bury, that ruling against it becomes more dangerous than ruling for it." He was very quiet. "That is," she added, "a longer game than you might like." "How long?" She looked at the 30 remaining trees. "About as long as it takes to bring an orchard back from the edge," she said. "Which I cannot tell you exactly, but I can tell you it's possible." He looked at her for a long measuring moment. Then he picked up his spade. "Next tree," he said, and they went back to work. That evening, Eleanor sat at the desk in her room with the hidden ledgers open in front of her and a fresh sheet of paper beside them. She had a system one her mother had taught her for managing the household accounts when her father's records had become too tangled to read. Column left what the records said. Column right what the records implied. And in the middle, the gap what was missing, what should have been there, what someone had worked to remove. She worked for 3 hours. By the time the candle had burned halfway, she had 4 pages of notes in her careful handwriting and a picture that was becoming slowly undeniable. The original Mercer Orchard debt, $1,200, signed by R. Caldwell, had been constructed deliberately to give the Caldwell interest a legal claim on the most profitable section of the Mercer Estate. The false assessment had then been used to classify the orchard as worthless, which prevented the Mercer family from challenging the debt based on the asset's value. And then, and this was the piece that had made Eleanor's hands go very still, when she'd understood it, the assessment had been used in county records to reclassify the land quietly over 2 years into a category that made it eligible for absorption under the Frontier Land Consolidation Acts, which meant the Caldwells weren't just after the debt repayment. They were after the land itself. The whole scheme, the debt, the false assessment, the arranged marriage to a family already in Caldwell's books, it was all architecture, a structure built to make the Mercer estate legally vulnerable without ever appearing to be an attack. Eleanor set her pen down. She pressed her fingers together and stared at the wall. Because here was the thing that the ledgers didn't say directly, but that the pattern made completely clear. Jonathan Mercer, cold, controlled, dismissive. Jonathan Mercer had not brought her here out of indifference. He'd brought her here because someone had told him he had no other choice, and that someone had been very careful to make sure he believed it. She went to find him. It was late past 9, which in this household appeared to be the point at which the house settled into its own silence, and each person retreated to whatever internal room they actually lived in. But she knocked on the study door, and when he said, "Come in the flat voice of a man expecting Mrs. Phelps with something mundane, and she came in instead, he looked up from his desk, with the particular expression of someone whose careful arrangement of solitude has been interrupted. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I need to show you something," she said, and laid her 4 pages of notes on the desk in front of him. He looked at them, then at her. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He read. He read slowly and completely, which she noticed he wasn't skimming, wasn't looking for the summary. He was reading the way a man reads something he needs to understand rather than something he needs to use. When he finished, he set the pages down. He was quiet for so long that Eleanor counted 32 seconds in her head before he spoke. "They want the land," he said. "Yes." "Not just the debt repayment." "No, the debt is the tool. The land is the goal." Another long pause. He stood up, walked to the window, stood with his back to her. "There was a man," he said finally. "My father trusted him. A man named Caldwell, not the partnership, the man himself. Richard Caldwell. They grew up in the same county, went to the same church." He paused. "My father thought he was offering a loan as a gesture of neighborly good faith. He signed what he was told to sign because he trusted the man handing him the pen." Eleanor said nothing, waited. "He was dead within the year," he said. "And I was left with a debt I didn't know the shape of, and records I couldn't read, and men who kept coming to the estate with documents that looked legitimate, and numbers that didn't add up, and—" He stopped. The silence had a jagged edge to it. "I am not a stupid man, Miss Whitmore." "I know that," she said. "Then you understand why it matters to me that I say this clearly. I did not bring you here because I wanted a wife. I brought you here because Caldwell's man told me the debt would be called in full before winter if I didn't satisfy the marriage condition. And I had no way at that moment to fight it. So I did the only thing available to me." He turned around. His face in the lamplight was not cold. She realized, looking at it clearly for the first time, that it had never actually been cold. It had been controlled. Those were not the same thing, and she had been confusing them since the moment she arrived. "I am sorry," he said, "for the manner of your arrival, and for my treatment of you since." Eleanor looked at him steadily. She took a breath. "Don't be sorry yet," she said. "Be useful." Something crossed his face. Surprise, maybe, or the particular unsteadying of a man who expected absolution and was handed a task instead. "What do you need?" he said. "I need the name of every man in this county who ever did business with your father and came away feeling he'd been treated fairly," she said. "Because those men are going to be our audience. And I need every document in this house that has a Caldwell signature on it, regardless of how small or how routine it looks. And I need you to write a letter to a man named Hargrove." His eyes sharpened. "You know about Hargrove. I know you tried to reach an attorney quietly," she said. "I don't know how you reached him or through whom, but whatever he said that made you burn his letter this morning." He stared at her. "You saw that." "I was at the kitchen window," she said simply. "Whatever he said, I want to know. Because the question he's answering might be the wrong question. And if it is, I'd like to give him the right one." He looked at her for a very long time. Then he sat back down at his desk. "Hargrove said the evidence was insufficient," he said. "Without a witness to the original transaction, someone who saw Caldwell sign the debt instrument without proper authority, the ledgers alone can be disputed." "Then we need a witness," she said. "The men present at that signing are either Caldwell employees or dead." "Not all of them," Eleanor said. "Your father's housekeeper at the time, where is she now?" He blinked. "Mrs. Hartley. Margaret Hartley. She retired to her sister's farm when my father died. She's in Albemarle County. Is she alive? As far as I know. Then, Eleanor said, I need you to find out for certain, quietly, through someone Caldwell doesn't own. He was very still. Miss Whitmore, he said slowly. What you're describing, building evidence, finding witnesses, constructing a case, quietly enough that Caldwell doesn't know we're building it, that takes months, possibly longer. Yes, she said. And in the meantime, they'll be watching the estate, watching us. Yes, she said again. So we have to appear, as if nothing has changed, she said, as if this arrangement is exactly what it appears to be. A wife brought to satisfy a debt condition, settling into an estate, doing nothing remarkable. He looked at her. You, he said, are not what I expected. No, she agreed. I imagine I'm not. He was quiet for a moment. Then, and it was small, and she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching closely, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the ghost of one. The memory of what a smile felt like on a face that had been holding itself in check for a very long time. The neighbors my father trusted, he said. I can name 6 immediately. Good, she said. Hargrove can be reached through a man named Alston in Richmond. No Caldwell connection. Better, she said. And Margaret Hartley. He paused. Thought. I can send Tom's father. Caldwell won't think twice about a field hand traveling to Albemarle on personal business. Eleanor nodded. Don't tell Tom's father the reason, not yet. Just ask him to find her and confirm she's well. Nothing more. He nodded. She gathered her pages from his desk, folded them precisely, and stood. One more thing, she said. He looked up. The orchard, she said. I want to keep working on it. Every day, visibly in full view of anyone who passes on the road. I want people to see those trees improving. He frowned slightly. Why? Because a man who is scheming to take your land needs it to look worthless, she said. And because a living orchard is a statement. It says this land is tended, this land is cared for, this land has someone who intends to stay. Something in his face, that controlled, careful face, shifted again, deeper this time. You intend to stay, he said. It wasn't entirely a question. Until this is finished, she said. Yes. He looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than necessary. Then he looked back at his desk. Good night, Miss Whitmore, he said quietly. Good night, Colonel, she answered. She went back to her room. She lay in the dark for a while, listening to the summer sounds outside the window, the insects, the soft movement of wind across the fields, the distant sound of the creek she hadn't yet located but could hear on quiet nights. She thought about the orchard, about 10 trees with their ground opened up and breathing, about 30 more still waiting, about a woman named Margaret Hartley in Albemarle County who might have seen something 20 years ago at a desk in this house that she hadn't understood was important. About a man downstairs who had been drowning slowly and methodically for 4 years and had been too proud or too alone or too hollowed out by grief and pressure both to ask for a rope. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the letter on the table, the particular Tuesday morning certainty that her life had just stopped belonging to her. She turned onto her side. It hadn't stopped, she thought. It had simply gone somewhere else, somewhere harder and stranger and considerably more complicated. But somewhere that was for the first time in a long time, genuinely concretely her own. Outside, a night wind moved through the orchard. 30 trees still waiting. She would get to them. She always did. Tom's father left for Albemarle County on a Thursday. Eleanor knew because she watched him go from the orchard, a broad-shouldered man named Samuel, who had taken the errand without question, the way a man takes an errand from a person he's decided quietly and without announcement to trust. He'd looked at Eleanor once before he left, not a long look. Just the particular look of a man confirming something he'd already made up his mind about. She went back to work. The orchard was on its 14th tree now. The first 10 were already showing something. Not leaves, not yet nothing so dramatic as that, but a loosening. a kind of ease in the soil that hadn't been there before. When Eleanor pressed her hand flat against the ground at the base of the third tree on a Tuesday morning, she felt the difference clearly. The earth gave slightly under her palm. Breathed. She didn't say anything to anyone about it. She just moved to the 15th tree and kept going. Tom had become a fixed feature of the mornings now. He arrived without being summoned, worked without being directed, and had developed the habit of reporting his observations to Eleanor with the serious thoroughness of a person who has discovered the satisfaction of being genuinely useful. "The north-facing trees are holding moisture better than the south ones," he told her one morning, crouching at the base of tree 16 with a stick and a frown. "Could be the shade from the fence line." "Could be," Eleanor said. "Or it could be the root depth. Check how far down you hit resistance on the north side versus the south." Tom dug, reported back. They adjusted their approach. Jonathan Mercer watched all of this from a careful distance that decreased Eleanor noticed by approximately 1 tree per day. By the end of the second week, he was working alongside her every morning, without either of them having formally acknowledged that this was now a thing they did together. The first warning came on a Wednesday. Not a dramatic warning. Not a threat delivered in the open. It came in the form of a man on a gray horse who stopped at the estate gate, spoke briefly with the stable hand, and left without coming to the door. Mrs. Phelps reported it to Eleanor at noon, with the careful neutrality of a woman who understood exactly what she was reporting and wanted the record to show she had done so. "A man from the Caldwell office," Mrs. Phelps said, "asking after the state of the estate. General questions, whether things were settling in satisfactorily, whether the new arrangement was comfortable." Eleanor set down her fork. "What did Amos tell him?" "That things were quiet and ordinary," Mrs. Phelps said, "which is what I told him to say." Eleanor looked at her. Mrs. Phelps looked back with the expression of a woman who had been quietly on a particular side of this for longer than anyone had asked her about. "Thank you," Eleanor said. "I didn't do anything," Mrs. Phelps said, and went back to the kitchen. Eleanor found Mercer in the study that afternoon and told him about the writer. He didn't look surprised. "They check quarterly," he said, "making sure the estate isn't improving in ways they haven't accounted for." "Then they'll be back in 3 months," she said. "We need to be careful about what's visible from the road." He looked at her sharply. "You want to hide the orchard work?" "No," she said. "I want to control the story of it. There's a difference. Anyone who asks the orchard work is a wife's small project. Sentimental, not profitable, not strategic." She paused. "Can you say that convincingly?" He held her gaze for a moment. "I can say most things convincingly when I need to," he said. She believed him. Margaret Hartley was alive. Samuel came back from Albemarle on a Friday evening with dust on his boots and a folded note he handed to Eleanor without a word in the orchard, away from the sight of the road. Eleanor unfolded it. Samuel's handwriting was large and careful, a man who wrote infrequently, and therefore took it seriously. She is well, her sister's farm outside Scottsville. She remembers the Colonel's father kindly. When I said his son sends his regards, she said to tell him she never forgot what she saw, and she never stopped being sorry she didn't speak sooner. Eleanor read that last sentence twice. She never forgot what she saw. She folded the note, pressed it flat, put it in her apron pocket. "Thank you, Samuel," she said. He nodded, looked at the orchard. "Trees are looking different," he said. "They're coming back," she said. He looked at them for a moment with the expression of a man who had lived on this land long enough to have complicated feelings about it. Then he nodded again and walked back toward the south field. Eleanor went to find Jonathan Mercer. She found him at the desk writing a letter with the focused tension of a man choosing every word like it might be used against him, which she supposed it might be. She put the note on the desk in front of him. He read it. He read it again. When he looked up, something in his face was different. Not broken open, this man did not break open easily, and she had stopped expecting it, but shifted. Like a door that has been locked for a long time, and has just been turned in the lock, still closed, but no longer sealed. She saw the signing, he said. That's what it means, Eleanor said. She was a housekeeper, he said. They won't take a housekeeper's testimony over. They will, Eleanor said, if the housekeeper's testimony is corroborated by documentation. Individually, each piece is dismissible. Together. She pressed her 4 pages of notes flat on the desk beside Samuel's note. Together, it's a structure, and structures are harder to dismiss than individual facts. He looked at the papers, at the note, at Eleanor. We need to bring her here, he said. Not yet, Eleanor said immediately. If Caldwell knows she's been contacted, she becomes a target. We bring her here when we're ready to use her testimony, not before. And when is that? When the orchard is living, she said. When the neighbors are on our side. When the evidence is assembled completely. When we walk into that parish hall with everything and there's no version of events that holds up against it. He was quiet for a long moment. You've thought about this very carefully. I've thought about very little else, she said honestly. He looked at her, a long, direct look that had none of the flatness of that first morning. Why? He said. You could have. He stopped. Could have what she said. You could have come here and been quiet, he said. Kept to yourself, waited for the arrangement to resolve itself one way or another. You didn't have to make this your fight. Eleanor looked at him steadily. Someone built a trap out of your father's trust, she said. And then they used the trap to catch my family. And then they used my family to bring me here. She paused. It was always my fight. It just took me a few days to see the whole shape of it. He had no answer for that. He looked back at the papers. Write to Hargrove, Eleanor said. Through Alston in Richmond. Tell him you have a witness and 4 pages of documented discrepancy. Ask him what he needs to take this to a circuit court judge, not a county judge. Circuit. He picked up his pen. The orchard turned on a Thursday morning. Eleanor was at tree 26 when Tom appeared at her shoulder, breathing hard like he'd been running. Miss Eleanor, he said, tree number 3, come look. She followed him. Tree number 3. The first tree she'd worked, the one she'd tested on her very first morning. The one with the thin green line she'd found under the bark had put out leaves. Not many. 6, maybe 7. Small, pale, the tentative yellow-green of growth that has been a long time coming and isn't sure yet of its welcome. But leaves. Eleanor stood in front of that tree and stared at those 6 small leaves for a long moment. She heard Tom beside her not speaking, giving her the particular silence that children sometimes give adults when they understand that something important is happening, even if they can't entirely name it. Well, she said finally. Well, Tom agreed. She reached up and touched one of the leaves. Barely touched it, just the edge of her fingertip, the lightest possible contact. It held. Get the others, she said. Show them. Tom took off at a run. Eleanor stayed where she was. She pressed her hand flat against the bark of tree number 3 and felt the warmth of it alive. Warmth, the particular warmth of something that has been struggling toward the light and has just barely arrived. There you are, she said softly. Jonathan Mercer came out to see it at noon. He stood in front of tree number 3 with his arms at his sides and his hat in his hand. He'd taken it off without seeming to notice he'd done it, and looked at those 6 pale leaves with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something for so long that when it arrives, he doesn't quite know what to do with it. Eleanor stood beside him. She didn't speak. After a while, he said, My mother called this one the keeper. She said it was the strongest tree on the property. His voice was very low. She said it would outlast all of us. Eleanor looked at the tree. She was right, she said. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite the other thing, something in between. He put his hat back on. 26 trees cleared, he said. 14 to go, she answered. He nodded. And without another word, he picked up his spade from where he'd left it against the fence and walked to tree 27. Eleanor watched his back for just a moment. Then she followed. The letter from Hargrove arrived 11 days later. It was longer this time, more specific. The kind of letter a cautious man writes when he has decided that the situation has shifted enough to be worth his genuine attention. He needed 3 things, he wrote: a witness statement sworn and signed, the original debt instrument with Caldwell's unauthorized signature, and a record of the county assessor's payment proof that Dodd had been compensated for his false assessment. Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table while Jonathan stood by the window. "The witness we have," she said. "The debt instrument is in the ledgers, we have that. The assessor's payment." She paused. "That won't be in any Mercer record," Jonathan said. "No?" She agreed. "It'll be in Caldwell's books, or in Dodd's." She tapped the letter gently. "Where is Dodd now?" "Albemarle County," Mrs. Phelps said. "A comfortable farm. A farm he couldn't have purchased on an assessor's salary," Jonathan said. Their eyes met. "I need to know how he paid for it," Eleanor said. "Purchase date, amount, seller. If it was a cash transaction, if there's a deed record at the county clerk's office in Albemarle." "Public record," Jonathan said. "Public record," she confirmed. He looked at her. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel." She agreed. Samuel went back to Albemarle on Monday. He came back on Thursday. The farm had been purchased in the spring of 1812, 3 months after the Mercer Orchard assessment. Cash transaction. The seller was a man named Birch who had recorded the deed with the county clerk as was required. The purchase price was $420. $420. Cash. Paid by a county assessor. Eleanor wrote it all down. She added it to the 4 pages that were becoming 6, then 8, then 10, as the picture filled in around its edges with the particular clarity of a story that was always true but has been waiting for someone to write it down correctly. It was in the 3rd week of August when the real blow came. Not from Caldwell. Not from outside. From inside. Eleanor came downstairs earlier than usual before even the kitchen fire was lit, because she'd heard something in the night that she couldn't place, and that had kept her from returning to sleep. A door, maybe, or footsteps on the gravel outside. She'd told herself it was the wind, and known she was lying to herself. In the study, she found the panel open. The hidden shelf was empty. The ledgers were gone. Eleanor stood in front of that open panel for 5 full seconds without moving. Then she turned around and walked through the house with a speed she did not allow to become panic-checking. First the front door unlocked when she'd heard it locked the night before. Then the rear door the same. She found Mercer coming in from the rear yard, and his face told her he already knew, which meant he'd been up before her and had gone outside looking for whoever it was who had come and taken what they came for. "They didn't break anything," he said. His voice was controlled in the way that a voice is controlled when the thing underneath it is considerable. Whoever it was knew the house, knew where the panel was, got in clean, and got out the same way. Eleanor's mind was already moving. "The originals are gone," she said, "but I have notes. 8 pages of notes with specific citations to specific ledger entries, dates, amounts, page numbers, signatures." "Notes aren't originals," he said. "No," she said, "but they're a record of what existed. And if Hargrove can argue that the originals were removed specifically to suppress evidence, which he can, because we can document when they were last in our possession and when they went missing, then their disappearance becomes part of the evidence." He stared at her. "Think about it," she said. "An innocent man doesn't send someone to steal ledgers in the night. That theft is a confession." He was very quiet. "We have to move faster," he said. "Yes," she said. "Hargrove." "Yes. Write to him today, through Alston. Tell him the originals have been taken. Tell him we have a witness. We have documentation of the debt instrument's content. We have the assessor's farm purchase record from the Albemarle County clerk. Ask him what a circuit court needs to issue a preliminary injunction against any land transfer while the fraud claim is examined." He was already walking toward the study before she finished the sentence. She followed him. He sat down and wrote. Eleanor stood beside the desk and watched the letter take shape, and twice she put her hand on his arm when a sentence needed to be sharpened, and both times he looked at it, adjusted it, and kept writing without comment. The letter went out with the morning rider. That afternoon, Eleanor did something she had been building toward without quite allowing herself to acknowledge it. She called on the neighbors, not all of them. 3. The 3 names Jonathan had given her in those first days, men who had done business with his father and come away feeling they'd been treated fairly. She borrowed one of the estate horses dressed plainly and rode out with the calm purposefulness of a woman making a social call, which in the summer of 1815 in rural Virginia was the least suspicious thing a woman could do. The first man was named Hallett. He was 60, white-haired, with the slow-moving deliberateness of someone who has lived long enough to take his time about things. He met her on his porch with the careful courtesy of a man uncertain of what he was being visited for. "Mr. Hallett," Eleanor said. "I understand you knew Colonel Mercer's father." "Knew him well," Hallett said. "Good man, fair man." "I believe he was," she said. "I wonder if you ever had any dealings with the Caldwell interest during his time or after?" Hallett's eyes sharpened, very slightly, but she caught it. "I had one dealing with them," he said carefully. "About 5 years back. A loan offer. Terms seemed reasonable at first." "Did you take it?" she asked. "No," he said. "Something about the paperwork didn't sit right. The fiduciary language was—" He paused. "My daughter's husband is an attorney. He looked it over and told me to walk away." "What specifically didn't sit right?" Eleanor asked. Hallett looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The representation clause. The way it was worded, Caldwell's signature on the agreement gave him rights over the collateral that went well beyond what a standard creditor would hold. It was written to look like a protective measure for the borrower. It wasn't." Eleanor felt something click cleanly, precisely like a key fitting a lock. "Would you be willing," she said, "to describe that language in a written statement? If it became relevant to a legal proceeding." Hallett was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The Colonel's father was a good man who trusted the wrong person. That's not a moral failing. That's just misfortune." He paused. "And I've lived in this county long enough to be tired of watching the Caldwell interest treat other men's misfortune as an opportunity." "Is that a yes?" Eleanor said. "That's a yes." "Mrs. Mercer," he said, and it was the first time anyone had called her that the actual name without the distance of Miss Whitmore, and she held it without showing that it landed. "Thank you, Mr. Hallett," she said. The second neighbor's name was Pruitt. He was younger, more cautious, and spent 20 minutes asking careful questions about what exactly was being alleged and through what legal channel. Before he said finally, "If Hargrove is handling it, I'll give a statement. Hargrove doesn't take cases he can't win." Eleanor said she would pass that along. The third was a woman named Mrs. Cook, a widow in her 60s, who had known the senior Mercer for 40 years, and who, upon hearing Eleanor's first careful sentence about the Caldwell interest, put down her teacup and said flatly, "I knew something was wrong the year he died. Robert Mercer was not a man who made financial mistakes. He was meticulous. Whatever happened to that estate was done to him, not by him." "I believe you're correct," Eleanor said. "What do you need?" "Testimony," Eleanor said. "In writing sworn, about his character, his meticulousness, the way he managed his affairs." "I'll write it tonight," Mrs. Cook said. "And you can tell anyone who questions my recollection that I have a 40-year memory for detail, and I have never once in my life confused what I saw with what I was told." Eleanor rode home in the late afternoon with 3 commitments, and the first faint sensation barely there, carefully held of something shifting in the weight of this. She told Jonathan that evening. He listened to all of it. Hallett's language clause, Pruitt's conditional yes, Mrs. Cook's 40-year memory, without interrupting, which she had learned was his way of listening to things that mattered to him. The things that didn't matter, he interrupted quickly and efficiently. The things that did, he heard to the end. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You rode out to them alone." "Yes," she said, "without telling me. I didn't think you'd object. If I was wrong—" "I'm not objecting," he said. His voice was strange, not quite rough, something adjacent to it. He stopped, started again. "I've been trying to build this case for 2 years," he said. 2 years, and I've been doing it alone and in the dark, and against a wall that never moved." He paused. "In 3 weeks you have a witness, 3 neighbor commitments, a documented land purchase, and 8 pages of referenced notes." Eleanor looked at him. "You had the foundation," she said. "I just understood how to build on it." He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement, in something she couldn't quite name. "We need to bring Margaret Hartley here," he said. "Soon," she agreed. "Not yet. Not until Hargrove tells us what the circuit court requires for a formal filing. And in the meantime, she said, "we finish the orchard." He looked at her with that expression she was learning, the one that lived just below, controlled in the place where the control had learned to be a little less total. "There are 6 trees left," he said. "I know," she said. "I counted them this morning." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "We should finish them tomorrow." "Yes," she said. "Together," he said. And it wasn't a question this time. Eleanor held that word for just a moment, the smallness of it, the weight of it. What it cost a man like this to say a word like that without dressing it in something harder. "Together," she agreed. She stood to leave, reached the door. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She turned. He was looking at his desk, not at her. "Eleanor," he said, correcting himself, quietly, like he was trying it out to see if it fit. "Thank you." She stood in the doorway for one moment. "Get some sleep, Colonel," she said. "We have 6 trees tomorrow." She went upstairs. Outside, the Virginia summer hummed and breathed in the darkness, and somewhere in the orchard, 26 trees that had been dying a slow and deliberate death stood with their ground opened up, and their roots breathing, and their cambium alive, still fighting, still holding, still not done. 6 more. And after the trees, the truth. And after the truth, whatever came next. Eleanor Whitmore pressed her palms flat against the cool wall of her room and breathed in the night air and let herself for just a moment feel the full weight of how much had changed in 3 weeks. Then she folded it away, lay down, and slept. They finished the last 6 trees on a Friday. It wasn't ceremonial. There was no moment of formal completion, just Eleanor and Jonathan working side by side through the morning heat, moving from tree 35 to 36 to 37, with the focused quiet of 2 people who have learned each other's working rhythm without ever sitting down to discuss it. Tom was there. Samuel's daughters Mary and June had come again. Even Mrs. Phelps appeared at mid-morning with water and stayed longer than necessary watching the last tree get its ground opened, with an expression she would have denied was emotional if anyone had been foolish enough to mention it. When they finished tree 40, Eleanor pressed both palms flat against the bark and held them there. Jonathan stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Tom said from 3 feet away, with the perfect timing of a child who has no idea he's interrupting something, "Now what happens?" Eleanor took her hands off the tree. "Now we wait," she said, "and we watch, and we keep the ground clear." "That's it. That's everything," she said. "Growing things don't need drama. They need consistency." Tom considered this. "That sounds boring." "Most important things are," Eleanor said. Jonathan made a sound beside her, a short, quiet sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him in all the weeks she'd been here. She didn't look at him, but she felt it the way you feel a change in the air before you see what caused it. They walked back toward the house together, and the orchard stood behind them all. 40 trees, ground-cleared roots, breathing, 6 of them, already carrying leaves. And for the first time since Eleanor had arrived at Mercer Estate, it looked like what it had always been. A living thing that intended to keep living. Hargrove's second letter arrived on a Saturday. Jonathan brought it to the kitchen, where Eleanor was working through her notes, now 12 pages organized by date and category, cross-referenced with a precision that had started to feel like a second language. He set the letter on the table in front of her without a word, and stood back while she read it. Hargrove was ready. Not cautiously ready. Actually ready. The kind of ready that only happens when an attorney has looked at a case long enough to believe in it, when the evidence has crossed from sufficient into compelling. He needed 4 things to file with the circuit court. First, the sworn witness statement from Margaret Hartley. Second, the Albemarle County deed record for Dodd's Farm, certified copy. Third, the written neighbor statements Hallett Pruitt and Mrs. Cook. Fourth, Eleanor's 12 pages of referenced notes, formally notarized and signed. And he needed them within 30 days. Because, and this was the sentence that made Eleanor go very still, Hargrove had learned through his own channels that the Caldwell interest had filed a preliminary motion in county court to begin the land reclassification process. They were moving, which meant the ledger theft had been a signal, not just a crime. Caldwell knew something had shifted. He was accelerating. 30 days, Jonathan said. 28 now, Eleanor said. She set the letter down. Margaret Hartley first. She needs to come here, give her statement to Hargrove in person, and sign it before a witness. I'll send for her today, Jonathan said. Through Samuel. No other messenger. Through Samuel, he agreed. He was already at the study door. Then he stopped, turned back. Eleanor. She looked up. The county court motion, he said. If Caldwell is filing in county, Hargrove files in circuit before the county ruling has time to stand, she said. I know, that's why 30 days is the real number. Hargrove isn't counting from today, he's counting from the date of Caldwell's filing. Jonathan looked at her. When did Caldwell file? She asked. The letter is dated 8 days ago, Jonathan said. Then we have 22 days, Eleanor said. Go send Samuel. He went. Eleanor picked up her pen and started on page 13. Margaret Hartley arrived on a Tuesday. She was older than Eleanor had pictured, 70 perhaps, with white hair and hands that shook slightly, but eyes that did not shake at all. Samuel brought her in the farm wagon, and she descended from it with the careful dignity of a woman who has been doing difficult things with grace for so long, it has become her natural posture. Eleanor met her at the door. Margaret looked at her for a moment. Looked at her the way older women sometimes look at younger ones who are doing something hard, with a recognition that has nothing to do with having met before. You must be the one who got the orchard moving again, Margaret said. I had help, Eleanor said. That's what people who did the work always say, Margaret replied and came inside. Jonathan was waiting in the study. When Margaret saw him, she stopped in the doorway and something moved across her face. A complicated thing, part grief and part guilt, and part the relief of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just been told they can set it down. Colonel, she said quietly. Mrs. Hartley, he said. Thank you for coming. I should have come sooner, she said. I should have spoken sooner. After your father, her voice caught, held, steadied. I knew what I saw that day. I knew what it meant. And I told myself I couldn't prove it, couldn't make anyone believe a housekeeper's word against Richard Caldwell's, couldn't. She stopped. I was afraid, she said plainly. I'm not proud of it, but I was afraid. Jonathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're here now, Mrs. Hartley. Yes, she said. I am. Eleanor brought a chair, and the woman sat down. And for the next 2 hours, Eleanor wrote down every word Margaret Hartley said about the day in the winter of 1811, when she had been carrying a tray of coffee to the senior Colonel Mercer's study, and had heard through the partially open door Richard Caldwell's voice reading aloud from a document, and then in a different tone the scratch of a pen, and Caldwell's voice again saying, Sign here, Robert. It's just the standard fiduciary clause. Protects you as much as it protects me. And then the sound of the pen. And then, in Robert Mercer's voice, quieter, a little uncertain, Richard, should I have my attorney look? And Caldwell, smooth and immediate. Robert, we've been friends for 30 years. Do you trust me, or don't you? A pause. And then the pen again. Margaret had stood in the hallway with the tray going cold in her hands, and she had known in the way that people sometimes know things before they can explain why they know them that something wrong had just happened. She'd gone back to the kitchen. She'd told herself she had misunderstood. She'd been telling herself that for 4 years. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Jonathan had not moved from his chair by the window for the entire 2 hours. He asked to have his attorney look at it, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Margaret said, and Caldwell stopped him. Yes. Another silence. Mrs. Hartley, Eleanor said carefully. Would you be willing to give this account again formally in front of an attorney signed and sworn? That's why I'm here, Margaret said simply. It's 40 miles from Scottsville, and I'm 71 years old, Mrs. Mercer. I did not make that journey for tea. Hargrove came to the estate 3 days later. He was a compact, quick-moving man of about 50 who assessed everything in a room within approximately 30 seconds of entering it, and had the particular economy of speech that belongs to attorneys who have learned that unnecessary words cost time they don't have. He shook Jonathan's hand. He shook Eleanor's hand. He looked at her 12 pages of notes. He was quiet for about 45 seconds. Then he said, "Who organized these?" "I did," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "You did the cross-referencing by date and category?" "Yes." "And the discrepancy analysis in the final 3 pages?" "Yes." He looked at the pages again, then at her. "Mrs. Mercer, if you ever decide you want to practice law, find me." Eleanor said nothing, but beside her she felt Jonathan shift a small movement, the kind that means something. Hargrove took Margaret's statement formally with Eleanor and Jonathan as witnesses. It took the better part of a morning, and when it was done, Hargrove signed it. Margaret signed it, and Hargrove folded it with the particular reverence of a man handling something he intends to use. "The neighbor statements," he said. "Collected," Eleanor said. "Hallett Pruitt and Mrs. Cook, all signed. The Albemarle deed record." "Certified copy," Jonathan said, and handed it across. Hargrove looked at it, made a sound. $420, he said. "Cash." He looked up. 3 months after the assessment. "Yes," Eleanor said. "That," Hargrove said, "is going to be very useful." He stayed for supper at Mrs. Phelps' insistence, which was delivered in a tone that made it clear the invitation was actually a directive, and over the meal he laid out the plan with the precise efficiency of a man who has been thinking about nothing else for the past 2 weeks. He would file in the 4th Circuit. He had a judge there, not friendly exactly, but honest, which was better. The filing would include the fraud claim, the unauthorized signature evidence, the false assessment documentation, and the witness testimony. He would simultaneously petition for an emergency injunction to halt the county court land reclassification until the circuit court had ruled. If the injunction is granted, he said, Caldwell cannot legally transfer or reclassify the Mercer land while the case is pending. That's the first wall. "And if it isn't granted?" Jonathan asked. "Then we have about 10 days before the county ruling stands, and the land reclassification becomes significantly harder to undo." He paused. "But it will be granted," he said with the calm certainty of a man who has read the evidence 3 times and believes it. "I've seen judges dismiss stronger claims than this. I have not seen them dismiss claims with this level of documented corroboration." Eleanor set down her fork. "When do you file?" "Monday," Hargrove said. 4 days. Jonathan looked at Eleanor across the table. She looked back at him. 4 days. On Sunday evening, the second warning came. This one was not a man on a gray horse with general questions. This one was a letter delivered by hand to the estate gate at dusk by a writer who did not give his name and did not wait for a response. Jonathan opened it in the study. Eleanor was beside him. The letter was short, unsigned, written in a neat, businesslike hand that was somehow more frightening than a rough one. "It has come to our attention that certain parties connected to the Mercer Estate have been engaged in correspondence with legal representatives and county residents regarding matters of private financial arrangement." We write to advise that any attempt to challenge instruments of established debt through legal proceedings will be met with immediate acceleration of all outstanding obligations, including those currently held against associated family accounts. Eleanor read it twice. Associated family accounts. Her mother. She felt something cold and precise move through her. Not fear exactly, but the specific recognition of a threat that has been designed to hit the exact right place. They know, Jonathan said. His voice was very controlled. They knew before the ledgers, Eleanor said. The ledgers confirmed it. This, she set the letter down. This is them telling us they know we're moving. They're threatening your family, he said. Yes. Eleanor, I know, she said. If we file and it doesn't go, I know, she said again. He was quiet. Then, I can stop it. I can tell Hargrove to hold the filing. Negotiate with Caldwell directly, try to find some middle ground that doesn't put your mother at risk. Eleanor looked at the letter for a long moment. Then she looked at Jonathan. My mother's debt to Caldwell, she said. What is it built on? He frowned. What do you mean? I mean, what is the original instrument, the original contract she signed? He thought. The loan agreement, from 3 years ago. Do you know the terms? Not specifically. I do, Eleanor said. I read it before I left home. My mother showed it to me the night before I came here. She paused. Jonathan, the fiduciary clause in my mother's loan agreement. It uses the same language as the clause in your father's debt instrument. The same language, practically word for word. He stared at her. Hargrove's filing, she said. If the circuit court rules that the original Mercer debt instrument is fraudulent because of that clause, it establishes a precedent. A precedent that applies to every loan agreement Caldwell has ever written using that same language. She picked up the letter. Including my mother's. The silence stretched long enough that Eleanor could hear the evening insects outside and the sound of the fire settling in the grate. If we win, Jonathan said slowly, your mother's debt is unenforceable. If we win, Eleanor agreed. And if we stop now, my mother stays in debt, your land gets reclassified, and Caldwell writes the same clause into the next 100 loan agreements and the 100 after that. She set the letter in the fire, watched it catch. We file. Jonathan watched the letter burn. You're certain, he said. I am terrified, she said honestly. And I am certain. Those aren't the same thing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll send word to Hargrove tonight. We file at Monday's first session. Yes, she said. She watched the last of the letter blacken and go to ash. Then she said, I need to write to my mother. Of course, he said. She stood. He stood at the same time, both of them rising from the desk at once, and for a moment they were closer than they'd been in the weeks she'd been here. Close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes that she'd initially read as coldness, and now understood were something else entirely. The particular marks left by years of carrying something heavy and refusing to let anyone see the weight. Eleanor, he said, very quietly. She looked at him. Whatever happens Monday, he said. Whatever the outcome. He stopped. Tried again. You came here because 2 families were trapped. You didn't have to make it more than that. You could have been... He paused. You could have kept to yourself and waited it out. You said that before, she said. I know. His voice was low. I think I need to say it again. Because I spent the first week you were here treating you like a problem I had to accommodate, and I need you to know. He stopped. His jaw worked slightly. I need you to know that I understand what I was doing, and that it was wrong. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Get some sleep, she said. We have a hard week ahead. She went to write the letter to her mother. Hargrove filed at 9 o'clock Monday morning. By noon, the courthouse in the county seat was in the particular way of small communities where information travels faster than horses buzzing. Eleanor knew because Tom came running from the South Road at 2 in the afternoon, where he'd been helping his father with fencing and had encountered 2 men on horseback who had been talking loudly enough not to care who heard them, and what they'd been saying was that someone had filed a fraud claim in the Fourth Circuit against the Caldwell Financial Partnership, naming specific instruments, specific signatures, and a specific assessment that some people in this county had always privately thought smelled wrong. Tom delivered this report to Eleanor in the orchard with the breathless accuracy of a child who understood that he was carrying something important and had therefore memorized it precisely. "Who were the men?" Eleanor asked. "Hallett's son," Tom said. "And a man I didn't know, but they weren't upset about it. They sounded like it was good news." Eleanor pressed her hand against the nearest tree, number 3, the keeper, its 6 leaves now joined by 9 more, and breathed. "Thank you, Tom," she said. He looked at her. "Is it working?" "We'll know in a few days," she said. "But do you think it is?" She looked at the tree, at its 15 leaves pale and determined against the summer sky. "I think," she said carefully, "that truth has a way of being harder to stop than people expect, once it's moving." Tom nodded, satisfied, and went back to his fencing. Eleanor stood in the orchard with her hand on the keeper's bark, and she allowed herself for exactly the length of one slow breath to feel the full gravity of what had been set in motion on a Monday morning in August in a Virginia circuit court. And then she let the breath go, and went back to clearing ground. The injunction was granted on Wednesday. Hargrove sent word through Alston in Richmond, and the message arrived at the estate by Thursday, midday, a single sentence, not even a full letter. Injunction granted. County reclassification halted pending circuit ruling. Caldwell's attorney has been notified. Jonathan read it, standing in the hallway with Eleanor beside him. He read it twice. Then he folded it and stood very still for a moment, and Eleanor watched something happen in his face that she had not seen there before. Not relief, exactly, because relief implies the danger is over, and it was not over. Something more like the first solid ground beneath the feet of a man who has been standing in water for a very long time. "It's not the ruling," she said. "I know," he said. "It's one wall." "I know," he said again. He looked at her, and something in his expression, careful as he always was, had shifted open fractionally like a window in a room that has been shut too long. "You said 22 days, he said. "From Caldwell's filing." "Yes." "It's been 16. "Yes." "So we have 6 days before his county motion would have stood if we hadn't—" He stopped. "If we hadn't filed," Eleanor finished. "6 days, he said. "And we have a circuit injunction instead." "Yes." He looked at the folded message in his hand. Then he looked at her with that expression she'd been watching develop across weeks, the expression of a man who has been alone in a fight for so long that the arrival of someone fighting beside him has become slowly and against his every intention the most significant thing that has happened to him in years. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. "I don't know how to—" He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. "I am not good at—" "I know," she said, and meant it without condescension. "You don't have to be." He looked at her. "The orchard needs water," she said. "It hasn't rained in 5 days. A beat." "I know where the creek draws," he said. "Show me," she said. And they went. That evening, they sat on the rear porch after supper for the first time. Not by design, just by the particular coincidence of 2 people arriving at the same place at the same moment and finding that the moment was too settled to disrupt. Mrs. Phelps had left coffee on the porch table. The summer dark was coming in warm and soft and full of sound. They sat with their coffee and the evening between them and said very little. After a while, Jonathan said, "My father used to sit out here in the evenings." Eleanor listened. "After my mother died," he said, "he'd sit here and he'd talk to the orchard, not the way you talk to the trees." A pause. "More like he was telling her how things were going, reporting in." Eleanor wrapped both hands around her cup. "Did it help?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "I think it was less about whether it helped and more about the practice of it, the habit of speaking to someone even when they can't answer." He paused. "I thought it was strange when I was young." I understand it better now." Eleanor looked out at the dark shape of the orchard. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the south window, the garden her mother talked to on summer mornings when she thought no one was listening. "It's not strange," she said. He looked at her. "People need to speak their lives out loud," she said, "even when there's no one to hear, maybe especially then." He was quiet for a moment. "You miss her," he said. "Every day," she said. "Same as I told June." "When this is over," he said, and the words were careful, chosen the words of a man who has learned to be economical with promises. "You should bring her here." Eleanor stilled. "If she'd come," he said quickly. "I don't mean to. I only thought that she might—" "Jonathan?" Eleanor said. He stopped. "She'd come," she said simply. He nodded, looked back at the orchard. The silence between them had changed again. It kept changing. She had noticed the quality of it shifted by degrees, week by week, the way a room warms slowly from a fire that started small. It was not yet warm, but it was warmer. The crickets sang. The orchard breathed in the dark. And somewhere in a circuit court office, a filing with 12 pages of referenced notes and a 71-year-old woman's sworn testimony and a certified land deed and 3 neighbor statements sat in a judge's consideration waiting to become a verdict. Eleanor drank her coffee. Jonathan drank his. Neither of them said anything else for a long while. And in that particular silence, the kind that doesn't need filling, the kind that has earned its own right to exist, something that had no name yet, but was becoming one, settled quietly between them in the summer dark. Not finished, not safe, but real. And real, Eleanor had learned, was the only thing worth building toward. The circuit court ruling came on a Thursday. Not with ceremony. Not with any of the drama that Eleanor had spent the preceding 2 weeks bracing herself against. It came the way most important things come, quietly in an envelope carried by a rider who had no idea what he was delivering, and handed it to Amos at the gate like it was any other correspondence. Amos brought it to the house. Mrs. Phelps brought it to the study. Jonathan and Eleanor were both there. Had been there most of the morning, doing the particular kind of work that is not really work, but is the thing people do when they are waiting and cannot allow themselves to simply wait. Jonathan was writing letters that didn't need writing yet. Eleanor was reviewing notes she had already reviewed 4 times. Mrs. Phelps set the envelope on the desk between them and left without a word. They looked at it. Jonathan picked it up, held it for a moment, set it back down. "You open it," he said. Eleanor looked at him. "It's your estate." "You built the case," he said. She held his gaze for one moment. Then she picked up the envelope, broke the seal, and read. The silence lasted exactly long enough for her to reach the 3rd paragraph. Then she set the letter down on the desk and pressed both hands flat on either side of it. And she breathed one slow, deliberate breath, the kind that is not about oxygen, but about giving the body a moment to catch up with what the mind has just understood. "Eleanor," Jonathan said. She looked up. "The circuit court," she said, "has ruled the original Mercer debt instrument invalid. The unauthorized fiduciary signature is found to constitute fraud under Virginia statute." She paused. "The false assessment by Dodd is referred to the county sheriff for criminal investigation. The land reclassification has been permanently reversed, and the Caldwell Financial Partnership is enjoined from any further collection action against the Mercer Estate." The room was very quiet. Jonathan did not move for a long moment. Then he said very low, "And my father's debt?" "Discharged," she said. "Entirely." He put both hands on the desk and leaned on them, and Eleanor watched him do what she had never seen him do in all the weeks she had known him. He let go. Not of everything, not all at once, not in any dramatic way. But the thing he had been holding in the architecture of his posture and the set of his jaw and the controlled flatness he wore like armor, he let it go just slightly, just enough, and for one unguarded moment he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had been carrying a dead weight for 4 years and had just been told he could set it down. Eleanor did not look away. She let him have the moment without filling it. After a while he straightened. His eyes when he looked at her were not quite dry, but he did not apologize for that, and she did not ask him to. "My mother's debt," Eleanor said. "Hargrove needs to file the precedent application today." He blinked, shifted back into motion. "Alston, I already wrote their letter," she said, and put it on the desk in front of him. "I drafted it this morning. I just needed the ruling number to complete it." He looked at the letter, looked at her. "You drafted it this morning," he said. "Before we knew." "I drafted it 3 days ago," she said. "I just kept adding to it." He shook his head, not in exasperation, in something much closer to wonder. Then he picked up his pen, added the ruling number in the space she'd left for it, signed his name at the bottom as co-petitioner, and handed it back. "Send it with the fast rider," he said, "not the regular post." "I already told Amos," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said simply, and without decoration, "What would I have done without you?" Eleanor picked up this letter. "Something slower," she said, "and considerably more expensive." She walked to the door. "I'm going to the orchard." "I'll come," he said immediately. She stopped, looked back. "Give me 10 minutes," he said, and she understood he needed the 10 minutes and did not make him say why. "The keeper first," she said. "Meet me there." She went outside. The keeper had 23 leaves now. Eleanor stood in front of it in the late morning heat and counted them. She counted them every few days, the way her mother had counted the first blooms of the season. Not because the number mattered practically, but because some things deserved to be witnessed precisely. 23 leaves. Pale at the edges, still finding their color but holding. Growing. She heard Jonathan's boots on the ground behind her. He came to stand beside her. They looked at the tree together. 23, she said. "I counted 19 yesterday," he said. 4 more overnight. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "My mother would have liked you," he said. She had no patience for people who stood around waiting for things to improve on their own. Eleanor smiled, a real one, small and unguarded. "My mother would have found you entirely too serious," she said. "She would have made it her personal project to get you to laugh properly at least once before Christmas." He looked at her sideways. Would she have succeeded? "She succeeded with everyone eventually," Eleanor said. "She was very determined, and she made excellent pie." He was quiet for a moment. Then, and it was real, she heard it clearly, not the ghost of a laugh or the memory of one, but an actual quiet laugh, low and genuine, the sound of a man who has finally found something worth laughing at. He laughed. It lasted only a moment. But it was there. Eleanor turned back to the tree. "Jonathan," she said, "my mother's debt. Even with the precedent ruling, it's going to take Hargrove some time to formally discharge it. Weeks, possibly." "I know," he said. "We'll manage it." "I need to write to her today," Eleanor said. "She needs to know what's happening before she hears it from someone else. People talk in counties." "They do," he agreed. "Write to her this afternoon, and—" He paused. "Eleanor, ask her to come." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. Not as charity or obligation. I mean—" He stopped. Tried again with the particular effort of a man who has learned to be precise with language, but is working now in territory where precision keeps slipping. "This house has been empty for a long time. Not of people. Of the right kind of noise." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "The right kind of noise," she repeated softly. "She sounds like the kind of woman who makes a house sound like what it's supposed to sound like," he said. Eleanor pressed her hand against the keeper's bark. "She is," she said. "Then ask her," he said. Eleanor nodded. She would. The news reached the county, the way news always reaches small communities, not through any formal announcement, but through the particular osmosis of a place where everyone knows everyone's business, and the Hargrove filing had not been kept as quiet as they'd hoped, and the circuit court ruling was a matter of public record. By Friday afternoon, Tom had reported 3 separate conversations he'd overheard on the South Road. By Saturday morning, Hallett had ridden to the estate personally, not with questions, but with a bottle of good brandy and the expression of a man who has been vindicated in a private opinion he'd held for 5 years. Caldwell's man Fielding rode through town yesterday, Hallett said, sitting in the study with his brandy untouched in front of him and his hands on his knees. He wasn't asking questions this time. He was answering them, and not answering them well. "What kind of questions?" Jonathan asked. "The kind people ask when they've just found out that a man they've been careful not to cross has been found by a circuit court to be a fraud," Hallett said. "The kind that start with, 'Well, come to think of it, I always did wonder about that loan he offered my cousin, and that deed transfer back in '09. He paused. "People have long memories when they're finally allowed to use them." Eleanor sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened. "How many people?" she said. Hallett looked at her. "Enough," he said. "Enough that Dodd the assessor, Birch County Dodd, rode into Charlottesville on Friday and came back with an attorney, his own attorney, which tells you something about how confident he feels right now." "He's going to try to negotiate," Jonathan said. "He's going to try to minimize," Eleanor said. "There's a difference. Negotiating means he thinks he has something to offer. Minimizing means he's trying to decide how much of his own skin to give up to save the rest." Both men looked at her. "He'll give up Caldwell," she said. "If he's smart enough to see that the criminal referral gives him one option and cooperation gives him another." She paused. "Hargrove needs to know that Dodd has retained counsel. Today." Hallett reached into his coat and produced a folded note. "Hargrove already knows," he said. "He asked me to bring you this." Eleanor took it, read it, looked up. "Dodd has offered a sworn statement," she said, "in exchange for reduced exposure on the criminal referral." She looked at Jonathan. "He'll confirm the Caldwell payment. Confirm the assessment was falsified on instruction." Jonathan stared at her. "He'll give them Caldwell." "He'll give them Caldwell," she confirmed. Hallett picked up his brandy. "I'll drink to that," he said. The news about Dodd's statement reached the Caldwell interest by the following Monday. Eleanor knew because on Monday afternoon a carriage arrived at the estate gate, a formal carriage better appointed than anything she'd seen on this road, and the man who descended from it was not a rider with general questions or an unsigned letter with careful threats. It was Richard Caldwell himself. She knew who he was before Jonathan told her. She knew it from the way he carried himself, the particular posture of a man who has moved through the world with impunity for so long that even in crisis he still walks as if the ground belongs to him. He was 60 perhaps, white-haired, well-dressed, and the expression on his face was not one she had expected. It was not anger. It was calculation. He was still calculating. Even now, with Dodd's statement filed and the circuit ruling on record and his name in a legal document under the heading of fraud, he was still looking for the version of this where he came out ahead. Jonathan met him on the porch. Eleanor stood at the door. Caldwell looked at Jonathan, then at Eleanor, then back at Jonathan. "Colonel," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced. "I think we've allowed a legal matter to become unnecessarily adversarial." "Do you?" Jonathan said. "I believe there's been some misunderstanding about the nature of the original arrangement between my family and your father." "No," Jonathan said. Caldwell blinked. He had not expected to be cut off that quickly. "There has been no misunderstanding," Jonathan said. "The circuit court read the same documents you wrote and found them fraudulent. There is no version of this conversation where we are discussing a misunderstanding." Caldwell looked at Eleanor again. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I understand you've been involved in compiling certain materials. I wonder if perhaps with a clearer understanding of the full context—" "Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor said. Her voice was entirely calm. The particular calm of a woman who has been thinking about this conversation for weeks and has had time to decide exactly how she intended to conduct it. "The context is 12 pages of documented discrepancy. A witness who heard your father tell the senior Colonel Mercer to trust him before forging his fiduciary authority, and a county assessor who has provided a sworn statement confirming he was paid $420 in cash to falsify a property valuation. She paused. That is the full context. Caldwell's calculation shifted. She could see it, the small recalibration of a man who has just confirmed that there is no version of this conversation he can control. The Whitmore family debt, he said. It was his last card, and they both knew it. That obligation remains. No, Eleanor said. It doesn't. Hargrove filed the precedent application 2 days ago. The fiduciary clause in my mother's loan agreement uses identical language to the clause the circuit court found fraudulent. Her debt will be formally discharged within the month. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment in the flat, recalculating quiet of his expression, Eleanor saw the thing underneath the smooth surface. Not power, not confidence. Just a man who had built everything he had on other people's trust and other people's fear, and who was standing now on ground that neither of those things could hold anymore. You should leave Mr. Caldwell, Jonathan said. And I'd advise you to speak with your own attorney before you speak to anyone else. Caldwell looked at him. Then he turned, walked back to his carriage, and left without another word. Jonathan and Eleanor stood on the porch and watched him go. The dust settled. The road was empty. Jonathan exhaled a long, slow breath. He'll fight it, he said. He'll try, Eleanor said. With Dodd's statement and Margaret's testimony and the circuit ruling, he won't get far. But he'll try. She looked at Jonathan. Let Hargrove handle it from here. He looked at her. You're sure? We built the structure, she said. The structure stands on its own now. That's what structures are for. He nodded. They went inside. Board. The letter from Eleanor's mother arrived on a Wednesday. It was not the letter Eleanor had been expecting, the careful, understated letter of a woman who has learned to receive good news cautiously because good news has so often come with conditions. It was a different letter, shorter, written in a hand that looked to Eleanor's eye like someone who had been crying and had decided that was finished and had picked up the pen anyway. My dear girl, it began. I have spoken with the man from Hargrove's office and I understand what you have done. I am not going to try to put into words what I feel about it, because I don't have the right words, and I'm not sure there are any. I will only say this. I knew when I handed you that letter on a Tuesday morning in June that I was asking something from you that a mother should never ask of a daughter. I knew it, and I did it anyway, because I didn't know what else to do. You went anyway. And you did not just go, you did what you have always done, since you were small enough to stand under the apple tree in the yard and tell me it wasn't dead, it was just cold. You looked at the worst thing in front of you, and you figured out how to make it live again. I will come if you want me. Write and tell me when. All my love, always. Mama Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning while Mrs. Phelps made noise behind her that was clearly designed to give her privacy without leaving her alone, which was precisely the right thing to do. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully, pressed it flat, and put it in her apron pocket, with the same deliberateness she'd used to pack her mother's gardening book at the bottom of her trunk on the last Tuesday morning she'd woken up in her old life. She went to find Jonathan. He was in the orchard, which is where he was most mornings, now she had come to understand. Not always working, sometimes just standing among the trees with his coffee, and the particular quiet of a man who is rebuilding a relationship with something he had given up on. She found him at the keeper. She'll come, Eleanor said. He turned, looked at her face, not at the words, at her face, reading what was there with the careful attention he had developed over weeks of learning how she carried things. Good, he said quietly. She said she'll come when I write and tell her when. Then write her tonight, he said, and tell her soon. Eleanor nodded. She looked at the tree. 31 leaves now, pale at the very tips, deepening to green closer to the stem, finding their color with each passing day. Jonathan, she said. The orchard is going to produce this year, she said. Not fully, not like it should. The trees are still recovering, but some of them, the strongest ones, there'll be fruit before autumn. He was quiet for a moment. "You're certain? Look at tree 7, she said, and she pointed. He looked. Tree 7. One of the north-facing trees that Tom had noted held moisture better, had put out not just leaves, but buds. Small, tight, green-white buds along 2 of the lower branches, barely visible unless you knew to look for them. Jonathan looked at them for a long time without speaking. "My mother used to make apple preserves," he said finally. "In late September. The whole kitchen smelled of it for a week." Eleanor said nothing. She let him have the memory. "She made enough to last the winter," he said, "and she gave half of it away. Said there was no point making more than you could use if your neighbors were going without." Eleanor looked at him. "She sounds," Eleanor said, "like my kind of woman?" He turned to look at her, and there it was, full, unguarded, real. Not the ghost of it, or the memory. His face open and present, and looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has realized somewhere in the process of losing and fighting, and nearly losing again, that the person who came and stood beside him is not a circumstance he was handed. She is the reason any of this survived. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was low and careful, the way it got when he was about to say something he had been working up to. "When this arrangement was made, when you were told you were coming here, what did you think it would be?" She considered the question honestly. "I thought it would be something I would endure," she said, "until I could figure out something better. And now," she looked at the orchard, at all 40 trees, every one of them, with some form of life showing, now leaves buds the particular renewed dignity of things that have fought their way back from the edge. "Now," she said, "I think I was working with a much smaller picture than the one I'm actually in." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am not good at this," he said. "At saying what I mean about things that matter. I never have been. My father said I came out of the womb already trying to be dignified about everything, and never quite managed to look comfortable doing it." Eleanor bit back a smile. "He sounds like he knew you well." "He did," Jonathan said. "Better than I knew myself for a long time." He looked at the tree, at the buds on tree 7. "Eleanor, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly, without managing me, without saying the thing that's easiest or most practical." She turned to face him fully. "All right," she said. He looked at her, squared his shoulders slightly, an unconscious thing, the posture of a man asking something that costs him. "Is this?" He gestured not at the orchard, at the space between them, at the mornings, and the notes, and the coffee, and the porch, and every small thing that had accumulated between them over the weeks, like soil building up grain by grain, into something that can actually hold weight. "Is this something you want? Not the arrangement, not the estate, not the case or the orchard or any of the practical things." He paused. Am I something you want?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The summer held its breath around them. "Jonathan Mercer," she said. "I came here on a Tuesday morning in June, with one trunk, a dead orchard, and a husband who didn't look at me when he spoke." She paused. "I am still here. I fought for your land. I wrote 12 pages of notes by candlelight and rode out alone to your neighbors and sat across from Richard Caldwell on your porch and told him exactly what I thought of his arithmetic." Another pause. "I don't do that for arrangements." He looked at her. She looked back. "No," he said softly. "I don't suppose you do." He reached out carefully, deliberately, the way this man did everything that mattered to him, and took her hand. Not her wrist, her hand, her work-roughened, dirt-stained, leather-gloved, calloused hand. And he held it with the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is done second-guessing it. Eleanor looked down at their hands. Then she looked up at him. "The preserves," she said. He blinked. "What?" "This autumn, when the orchard produces." She squeezed his hand. "We make the preserves, and we give half of them away." Something moved through his face, past the controlled, and past the careful, and all the way down to what lived underneath all of it, which was, she now understood completely. Simply a man who had loved things deeply and quietly his whole life, and had learned to hide it because hiding it hurt less than losing it. Yes, he said, we do. The orchard produced that September. Not a full harvest, the trees were not yet back to what they had been, and Eleanor had always known they wouldn't be not this year. But 17 of the 40 trees produced fruit. Tree 7. First, the north-facing one, Tom had noticed its lower branches bending slightly with the weight of apples that were small and not perfect and absolutely real. Tom picked the first one. He held it up, a small red-green apple, imperfect and slightly lopsided, and looked at Eleanor with an expression of complete vindication. "You said they weren't dead," he said. "They weren't," she said. He bit into the apple, chewed, made a sound of satisfaction that was purely a child's and therefore absolutely honest. "It's good," he said, as if this were slightly surprising. "It generally is," Eleanor said, "when something's been allowed to become what it was always supposed to be." Eleanor's mother arrived on a Friday in late September. She came in Samuel's wagon at Eleanor's arrangement at Jonathan's insistence, and when she descended at the estate gate, Eleanor was waiting for her, and for a moment they simply held each other in the Virginia morning, with the orchard behind them and the house in front of them, and all the distance of the summer pressed between them and then gone. Her mother pulled back, looked at her. Really looked the way mothers look at daughters they have been worried about and are relieved to find intact. "You look well," her mother said. "I am well," Eleanor said. Her mother looked past her at the orchard, at the trees with their leaves turning now the particular red gold of early autumn, several of them still carrying the last of the season's fruit. "Good Lord," her mother said softly. "I had help," Eleanor said. "From who?" From behind Eleanor, footsteps on the gravel. She stepped aside. Jonathan Mercer stood there, coat on hat in hand, because he had thought about this introduction and decided what it deserved, with the expression of a man who is genuinely uncertain whether he is about to be liked, and finds to his own surprise that it matters to him considerably. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I'm very glad you've come." Eleanor's mother looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Eleanor, then back at Jonathan. "Well," she said briskly, in the voice of a woman who has made up her mind about something, "are you going to show me this orchard or not?" Jonathan looked startled. Then fully warmly, the laugh of a man who has finally stopped trying to be dignified about everything, he laughed. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Right this way." He walked toward the orchard. Eleanor's mother fell into step beside him. Eleanor walked behind them and listened to her mother ask pointed, specific, genuinely curious questions about soil drainage and root depth, and what variety were the north-facing trees, and listened to Jonathan answer every one of them with the detailed confidence of a man who had spent weeks learning alongside the woman who had taught him. She walked behind them through the orchard, and she thought about a Tuesday morning in June, and a dead arrangement, and 40 gray trees, and one thin line of green under the bark of the tree closest to the house. She thought about how far a thin line of green can go when someone decides to pay attention to it. When they reached the keeper, 37 leaves now strong and full and entirely certain of themselves, Eleanor's mother put her hand against the bark the same way Eleanor always did. She held it there for a moment. "This one's the oldest," she said. It wasn't a question. "The strongest," Jonathan said. "My mother called it the keeper." Eleanor's mother looked at the tree for a long moment. Then she looked at Jonathan. "She named it right," she said quietly. He nodded. Eleanor stood between her mother and her husband in the September orchard and felt simply, cleanly, without qualification, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had been sent here. Not because an arrangement had required it. Not because debt and obligation and someone else's scheme had moved her like a piece on a board. But because she had arrived in a dead place and refused to believe that dead was permanent, and she had been right, and the proof of it was all around her in 40 living trees, and a man who had learned to laugh again, and a mother making plans for preserves, and a boy named Tom who was already at tree number 7, checking whether there were any apples left. Eleanor Whitmore had come to Mercer Estate with nothing but a trunk, a pair of borrowed gloves, and the absolute certainty that living things could be brought back if someone was willing to do the work. She had been right about the orchard. And she had been right about everything else. That was enough. That was everything.